All right, let's try to understand how our government impacts policymaking. In particular, how does the form of our government and the institutions within it impact policymaking? When we think about the American political system, it's very much defined by the idea of checks and balances. Or we can think about it in terms of regulation. We regulate our system by counterbalancing the influences within the organization or the system itself. The goal is to make sure that political power is not concentrated in the hands of singular individuals or groups, thereby unbalancing the scales in our government. To understand this idea of checks and balances, we first need to think about two big structures within it. First, the idea of federalism, and then the idea of the separation of powers between the three branches of government. Federalism is our form of government. It has to do with a power sharing arrangement between the federal government and the subnational entities otherwise known as the American states. More specifically, it has to do with what the states and the federal government can and cannot do, and ultimately what they can make policies on. The distribution of power between the federal government and the states has been a concern since the founding of the country, and you can find it explicitly defined in numerous places in the US Constitution, and further being defined by the actions of numerous political actors throughout history. Take, for example, President Lincoln. Prior to the Civil War, he had to assume a larger federal role with the goal of eradicating slavery. From the start of the country up until the Great Depression, basically the late 20s, around 1929, the powers of the American government, be it the national government and state governments, were clearly defined. The states controlled such things like education and transportation, whereas the federal government controlled specific things like national defense and trade. During this time, there was very little blending in terms of jurisdiction between what the federal government could do and the states could do. The federal government had ultimately a smaller amount of powers compared to the American states. Yet, the Great Depression caused a problem. If we think about it in terms of public policy is a response to a problem. The problem at this point was, well, the states were broke. The states were unable to meet their obligation to care for the general welfare of their populations. However, the federal government, thanks to the income tax, was sitting on large sums of money. And through the use of block grants and ultimately categorical grants and aids, the federal government transferred large sums of money into the state governments. This ultimately began the blending of lines of responsibility between the federal government and the state governments, moving us into a contemporary period of federalism. This use of money fundamentally altered the relationship between the federal governments and the state governments. The initial use of block grants and then categorical grants and aids, those grants that had some strings attached to them which the states had to follow in order to receive the money, gave the federal government a foot in the door into the jurisdiction of policy realms which typically were handled by the state government. Over time, the American states became more and more reliant on these federal funds and began to substitute large portions of their budgets or supplement large portions of their budgets with this money. As the states became more and more reliant on federal funds, the federal government realized that it ultimately had a stranglehold on the American states and was able to start dictating down to them policy prescriptions which they'd like to see them implement. These policy prescriptions, however, came with no money attached, otherwise known as unfunded mandates. States were responsible for implementing the political will of the national government, however, there was no funding to help implement it. So why didn't the American states just say no? Because they were still receiving large amounts of federal dollars for other things like transportation, and if they said no, the federal government ultimately could have cut that funding. And remember, large portions of their budgets were already made up of federal funds, and if the federal government were to cut it, they ultimately would have to substitute more money via taxation or cutting spending to replace that funding. This change in federalism has given the federal government significant authority over the American states throughout time. In the wake of these changes to federalism, states have had to shoulder more and more responsibility handed down to them by the federal government. And we ask the question of whether states can handle this responsibility. We think about this in terms of the concept of what we call policy capacity, or basically the ability of a government to identify, assess, and respond to public problems. Yet not all states are created equal. States vary in terms of their people, their history, the skills, the needs, the values, the budgets, the methods, all the things that make a state unique. Think about all the states in the country. Which would you consider having good policy capacity? When I say good, you can put it in quotation marks there if you'd like. Are you thinking about states like New York, California, Texas? Why? How can you tell that these might be good policy capacity states? It's because they're large. They have large incomes, large economies. You hear about them in the news all the time. What about your home state? How would you tell if it has good policy capacity? Taken together, the capacity of the state dictates its ability ultimately to respond to public problems.